On both August 6th and August 9th of 1945, nuclear bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is a big part of history that everybody knows. But the story that doesn't get talked about as much is Japan's culture before and after the war. Why did they start to use Western homes and Western clothes from kimonos? And more importantly, why did they start to use Western music? Enough to the point of influencing some of your favorite songs from Japanese media, like the theme for Super Mario Brothers, to the point of having a jazz lick like this. In a Mario Kart game. The answer to that is jazz. Jazz is a genre with a small fan base in the United States, but in Japan, it's been picked up as one of the dominant genres in the country, even though it was born in the United States. Japan literally has lots of jazz fusion bands that everybody and their grandma knows within that country, and not many US jazz fusion bands could be said to have the same effect. Even the genres that aren't jazz music in Japan obviously take some jazz influences. Jazz pop is jazzier than American pop, jazz rock is jazzier than American rock, and Japanese rap leans into a lot of those jazz-inspired beats pushed by J Dilla. This influence is all over, and if you're a fan of Japanese media in any way, you've heard it somehow. Which leads us to the overall question of, why do the Japanese like jazz so much, and what made them use it so heavily within their culture? To best answer this question, we have to look back at the past of the country to see how what we hear now is built from the past hardships. Going back a bit to right after World War I, after playing a big role within a war, the Japanese people were making money as a whole, like the economy was going up. With more money in their pockets, the Japanese citizens took a lot of inspiration from Western ideas like consumerism and democracy. This started a split between the younger generation and the older generation who tried to suppress these Western ideals in Japan. One of the biggest forms of Western culture they wanted to silence was jazz. Now, I know that you hear basically in every music analysis video about how jazz is included within a Japanese soundtrack. But to put this in perspective, the first Japanese movie that had sound used jazz as part of the soundtrack. Jazz represented the Western ideals of freedom that were being spread across Japan. With the Japanese being so split with their beliefs, the people in the nation didn't know what it meant to be Japanese anymore. They lost their identity. Taking a look at the film I just mentioned, The Neighbor's Wife and Mine, the story is about a playwright who moves to the countryside to quietly finish a script that he's struggling to finish, but he gets interrupted by the neighbor's jazz band, which in this case is The Neighbor's Wife, or America's Wife. He steps into the house at first to think about complaining to the band, but he gets shocked by seeing how different they live and act and dress. Eventually, he gets sucked up into the world and is caught by ideas of presumed freedom and little to no responsibility compared to his own life. And once he gets back and his wife realizes that he's been enjoying himself, she starts to demean both her husband and the neighbor. But then within the same scene, she goes back to ask for a dress in the same similar type of dress that the neighbor was wearing. While on the outside, they wanted to push back against those Western lifestyle choices, they were also extremely attracted to them. This is a perfect representation of how the general public of Japanese felt about the things from the United States at the time.
私のこの夏の世界の間には何のつながりもないようでした。本当の私はどっち？悲しみと驚きで涙に暮れながら自分を見つめた時に聞こえた声は尋ねた。
They also had a desire to gain respect within the world and become more than just Japanese citizens and become world citizens. Jazz being the music of the United States, by default it represented freedom and other U.S. ideals. Wynton Marsalis, one of the world's current greatest trumpeters, believes in the power of freedom and democracy that jazz holds.
The act of swinging is a metaphor for finding, valuing, and nourishing common ground. To swing is to give individual interests less importance than the interests of the community. It is ethics, not laws. You choose not to have your way so that we can find our way. And not just for a short time. Musicians in the rhythm section compromise on every beat. And in the life of a song, that's a whole lot of adjusting.
Though jazz had already been listened to by a good portion of Japanese citizens, they weren't aware that it was started by Black Americans in the United States. The Japanese were mostly fed a mild version of jazz that was made popular because certain white musicians thought that how it was performed in the African American community was primitive. In the words of Paul Whiteman, one of the main guys who made this milder version of jazz popular, stated this:
"Tremendous strides have been made in popular music from the day of discordant popular music, which sprang into existence about 10 years ago, to the really melodious music of today, which, for no good reason, is still called jazz."
Which meant that he'll remove all of the black elements away from the music. But ironically, Duke Ellington, often cited as America's greatest composer, was a ghostwriter and composer for Paul Whiteman's band. Let's take a look at one of the three elements Wynton Marsalis says makes jazz, the rhythmic concept of swing.
Now, many of you may think that melody is the most basic because that's what we recognize, it's what we remember. The melody is the song, for example. We all recognize this melody. But what if we take the rhythm away? What happens now? You see, we can't go to the next note without creating some type of rhythm. No motion, no rhythm. No rhythm, no music.
When the African slaves got to the United States, they brought along their concept of rhythm. For each beat, they separated into three smaller beats. We call that a triplet in Western music, which was combined with the military march, which gave it a duple feel, and that simply means that the beat is split into two smaller beats. The swing was created by combining these two things together and finding somewhat of a middle ground. The creation of swing itself is somewhat of a marvel and an example that really captures the beauty of the cultural melting pot that is America. Paul Whiteman tasked himself to rid jazz of the African element to make it more sophisticated for white audiences. Essentially, he profited from jazz with opportunities that could have never been offered to black musicians.
It was in that period, 1920, 21, 22, that Whiteman came to amazing prominence, and he was dubbed the King of Jazz because he was one of a number of people who were incorporating elements of jazz into his arrangements and recordings. He also recognized the value and importance of having that moniker attached to him, and he ran with it. He really didn't play jazz in the sense that Louis Armstrong or King Oliver or so many other black artists who really did pioneer jazz.
Just listen to the difference between his take on a jazz standard versus a band that plays it in a more standard traditional jazz way. When the Japanese found out that the music originated from black Americans, they felt conflicted that the same people who were still trying to be accepted in their country made the music they love while the Japanese were still trying to be accepted by the world. So you had two different demographics of people who were still trying to be accepted within that time, but on a different scale. And that caused even more of a rift within the Japanese citizens, with some people wanting to separate from jazz to not be deemed similar as the Black Americans, and others who wanted to sympathize with the Black Americans because they could understand them from that situation. Imagine one kid seeing another kid who gets picked on at school and they don't really interact together, and the other kid is kind of like getting together with the cool kids, but then they find out that they like the same interests and everything. And because they like the similar things, the kid who's trying to get more respect starts to empathize more with the kid who's being bullied, even if they never had previous relations. This further exaggerated the identity crisis of Japan, which was followed by an economic depression. Because of this, the more older and traditional side of Japan blamed American ideals and jazz for the country's loss of wealth and morality.
我が国の国語に反抗し、女性としての基準をめがし、青少年の余浜さを贖上し、我が国の公衆道的に少なからず悪影響を及ぼすジャズダンスホールやダンススクールの存在は華麗に望ましくない。
Which meant that no Japanese citizen was to ever listen to any type of jazz, whether it was gentrified or not. If we return a bit to right after the end of World War II and the defeat of Japan, we start to see the meteoric return of a nation and their identity. Having reached the lowest point of moral and self-identity, Japanese citizens were lost. During that time, the United States had an occupation in place with the goal of pushing Japan with its own culture and ideals. The United States had full control of the type of media that the Japanese population got to consume, and used that as a way to raise the United States' image in the eyes of the average Japanese citizen, which included lifting the jazz band and almost exclusively pushing Western classical and American jazz to the Japanese people. Being in a position of having no identity, the citizens of Japan weren't left with too many options to reject the American culture being put on them, and often sometimes even idolized a bit of the culture that was brought over to them. Even outside of the music, this can be seen within the adoption of sports like baseball and boxing, and a general change within the daily lives of the average Japanese citizen. So this is when they started to adopt more Western homes and Western forms of fashion. Despite this though, there was still a feeling of wanting to create something of their own and not just something from, either the white or the Black aesthetic. Something that could speak to the Japanese specifically about their experiences. And what better way to do this than through the mother of jazz, the blues? Headed back closer to the early 1930s, before the start of World War II, a man by the name of Hattori Rochi already had a vision for Japan's future, specifically in jazz, and wanted to establish a form of jazz they could call their own and authentically Japanese. In his memoirs, he stated this:
ウィリアム・ハンデイのセントポールのようにブルースを黒人が独占する必要はないと思う。ルイス・ブルース。日本にもジャパニーズ・ブルース、オリエンタル・ブルースがあってしかるべきだとお叱らはない。
In 1937, he released the Farewell Blues. He got past the jazz band by being put within the light music label or category. And this song is one of the first examples of being able to hear the Japanese spirit within jazz. This first spark was all that was needed for Japan to get a sound on their own. If we jump forward again to after the war of World War II, right at the tail end of the U.S. occupation over Japan, a generation of Japanese that grew up hearing jazz before the band and the music of Hattori Rochi came at the forefront to carry the vision of jazz. Between Sadao Watanabe, Sleepy Matsumoto, and Toshiko Akiyoshi, Japan had now gained some amazing musicians rivaling those back in the States. Specifically when it comes to Toshiko Akiyoshi, she made a big band with her husband, Lou Tabakin, with the first album of the big band featuring jazz music that used traditional Japanese instruments. This was maybe the most direct and straightforward way that somebody had ever combined the Japanese and the jazz sounds together to make something that was more unique as a Japanese version of jazz.
ダンスホール There was
Oh.
Before the war, there was a dance hall, I understand. I was too little to know about that. But during the war, there was anything like that. They were all no for the country. So after the World War II, all of a sudden there's a dance hall. And I really wanted to touch piano, and others, you can imagine, my parents lost everything. They could not buy a piano for me. So I took a job in dance hall.
Japan now having their own roster of excellent musicians that grew up with jazz, it defined the generations to follow that. Reaching towards the 1980s, Toshiko Akiyoshi has been awarded several continuous awards and garnered the label of 3-crown Queen of Jazz. In the mid-1980s, Japan was rated as the largest per capita market for jazz LPs. Lots of jazz artists from the States noticed this, and Japan almost became like a jazz haven with tours from people like Art Blakey, Chet Baker, and Coltrane, and many others. Not only was this a great time musically for Japan, but the whole country was on an economic boom, becoming a superpower for technology and building cars equal or even better than a US counterpart. We can see the manifestation of this Japanese jazz sound even in the other genres of music, all the way to a Mario Kart racing game. Some of which I've covered in previous videos, like the ending theme for Spy X Family. Their internal struggle for the country's identity was finally over. Sometimes I think in today's age, we focus too much on trying to separate everybody and giving strict labels and pseudo ownership to culture or cultural elements. Shows me that the human experience isn't limited by any artificial labels on who could do what or who can't do something, which is a beautiful thing in my opinion. Life shouldn't be limited based on your origins. If you want to dig in more to how video game composers actively were influenced by popular music of the 80s, hit that like and subscribe button to catch that video when it comes out. I hope you guys like this style of video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to also check out my sources below. Thanks to Taylor Atkins and Alexandra Coyle, who provided some amazing sources for me to dig into.